Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. Looks like we've already got quite a few people filling in, so we're just going to go ahead and get kicked off now since we're already 5 past the hour. So again, thanks for joining. Welcome to day 2 for our partner enablement training. Today we're focused around technical enablement training, and you've got a couple folks from Jumpcloud here with us today. Myself, I'm James Herbert. I head up our solutions engineering team here. And then we've also got Zach Bauer with us as well. He's one of my colleagues, and he's going to be kind of helping to field questions for us and keep an eye on the Q&A and the chat to make sure we stay on top of that. So do feel free to ask any questions using the questions feature in the GoToMeeting here, or GoToWebinar, excuse me. And if you have any general comments and whatnot, you can place those into the chat as well. So I'll try to answer questions kind of verbally as they come in, but if they're coming in really quick, Zach will be keeping an eye on them and kind of make sure that we're getting all the questions answered. If there's anything that for whatever reason we're unable to answer for you on the line today, we'll make sure to follow up with you after the webinar. So this is what we're going to be focused on today, really doing a technical deep dive demo of the platform. And these are these are pretty much all the areas that we're going to be focused on. So we'll look at users, groups, directory integrations, devices, policies, commands, and some other things that go along with device management. We'll look at user authentication and conditional access policies as well. And then we'll kind of finish with insights and compliance and reporting type things. So that is the agenda for the day. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump into it. So I'm just going to switch over to my other browser window here. So this is the homepage for the Jumpcloud console. This is kind of where, as an administrator, you can start your day. We'll draw your attention to anything that's kind of important that's going on within your environment. Obviously, this is a demo environment, so we have quite a few red flags here, but in an ideal world, this would all be green. You might have a couple user lockouts in the morning, that type of a thing. But this just alerts you to things that you might be interested in or might want to be aware of from a security perspective. And then, of course, you can link directly to these different items as well. There's another couple cool things here I'd like to point out. This is also where you can access Jumpcloud University. So if you've not already taken some of the courses in Jumpcloud University or gone through the course certification, highly encourage and recommend that. And you can find all kinds of cool resources there. There's troubleshooting guides, configuration guides, tutorials on how to set stuff up. Really, really valuable resource that you can use to really learn the Jumpcloud platform. So we're going to start and talk about users first, right? As a directory platform, one of the key things here is user management, right? So first off is how do we get users into the Jumpcloud platform? There's several different options and ways to do that. You can kind of see the list of all the users who currently exist here and some relevant information about them, their status, password status, whether or not multi-factor authentication is enabled, things like that. To actually create users, there's a few different options. For most organizations that you're working with, they probably already have some type of a directory solution, whether that's something like Azure AD, maybe Google Workspace, maybe even on-premises Active Directory. And we can integrate with all of those things and import users from those systems. We can also manually create users, or we could import from a CSV. So I'll start by kind of walking you through how these different directory integrations are set up, but then what we'll do is we'll actually go through the process of creating a brand new user object, and then we'll kind of look at all the different bells and whistles that you can play with when you're doing that process. And then later on, we'll set up a brand new device as well, and then bind that user to that device so you can kind of see a full end-to-end workflow on how to get a user set up and give them access to the resources. So let me jump over to the directory integrations here. So again, for most organizations that you're working with, they probably are using one of these two systems or potentially even both. And the process to set this up is relatively straightforward. Basically, you just need to authorize a connection using an administrator login, and then you'll be able to synchronize users from these various different sources. So with something like Google Workspace, for example, you make the OAuth connection to authorize that synchronization, and then you can actually pick and choose which users you want to select to do kind of the initial import, right? So you can choose which users are going to be brought in, and so that's kind of how you can initially get users into the Jumpcloud directory. A very similar process for Azure AD, right? We use the OAuth authorization flow to kind of authorize that connection, and then we can sync users into Jumpcloud from that directory source. One of the things that's important to note, and this kind of trips up some partners as well, is that when implementing Jumpcloud as a directory platform, the best way to approach it, so from a best practices standpoint, is it's best to implement Jumpcloud as the authoritative directory. So particularly with respect to user credentials, right? So when Jumpcloud acts as the authoritative directory, Jumpcloud then owns, manages the user password, and then we can synchronize that password out to various other systems like Google Workspace and like Azure Active Directory. And because we have single sign-on as well, we can handle authentication into other applications that the user might be accessing. But then with the other things that might be connected into Jumpcloud as well, like Ldap and Radius, again, for all of these things, it's kind of best to implement Jumpcloud as the authoritative directory where we can synchronize the password out to other things or do federated authentication, as opposed to trying to use something else as the authority. So that's one thing that's important to note there. And particularly because, like when we set up these directory integrations, for example, Google Workspace and Azure Active Directory, they don't want to give up their user passwords to other third parties, right? So it's not possible for us to sync the password from these systems into Jumpcloud, but we can write the password back to these systems as well, right? So again, that's why it's important to note that Jumpcloud should be the authoritative directory, particularly with regard to the user credential. Now with On-Prem Active Directory, it's a little bit different. So we do still have, customers, partners that have customers that use On-Prem AD. Obviously, the goal for most organizations is to get away from On-Prem AD and ditch it entirely and move to a cloud-based directory system. But a lot of organizations still have dependency on it as well. So we have two different agents that can be utilized to facilitate Active Directory import and synchronization as well. So there's an AD import agent, which does what it sounds like, where it can import users from an Active Directory domain. And then there's also an AD sync agent, which facilitates the bidirectional sync, right? So it can write back to Active Directory. Now, when you initially install the Active Directory import agent, there's a few different prerequisites. We're not going to get too deep into the weeds on how that's set up, but essentially it's an agent that gets installed on a domain controller. There's a service account that's used for that, as well as a Jumpcloud security group. And so as you add users into that Jumpcloud security group, that is what then synchronizes them or imports them up into Jumpcloud. And then we can actually sync the password in this scenario from AD on-prem after or following a password change, right? So after the AD import agent is all set up and configured, user changes the password on the domain, we can kind of intercept or capture that new password and sync that up to Jumpcloud. But then again, even after that initial import, even in the case of on-prem AD, it's best to have Jumpcloud act as the authoritative directory. We do also have some integrations with some HR systems. There's one with Workday, and there's also a method to set up Bamboo HR as a directory source. There's other HR directories that are kind of on the roadmap coming down the pipeline, but this is something that's just kind of something to be on your radar for now, because a lot of organizations are kind of moving towards that concept of HR-driven identity lifecycle. And so that's something that we can support today with some of these limited ones. Of course, we have a user API, so you could build your own custom integrations too, but that's something that is becoming more popular. Okay, so I'm just gonna kind of kick us off and create a brand new user, and we'll kind of use this user for demonstration purposes throughout today's session. So I'm gonna give this user a name, and I'm just gonna call him James Training. All right, and the username here is kind of something that's important to note, because the username is kind of how we match up users to a local machine profile. So we'll kind of get into more detail about that once we start talking about device management, but we'll kind of show all the different scenarios that could be possible. All right, and I'm gonna try to keep my eye on the questions box here as well. But looks like Zach is already answering some of them also. But I'll try to weave in some of the answers throughout my talk track too if I see them pop up. Okay, so let's see. So other things that you can set up here when we're initially creating a user, we can of course set up things like their initial password, which I'm going to do in this case. We can also require the user to change their password on their initial login. We can decide whether or not this user gets locked out after failed login attempts, and we can also configure things like their multi-factor settings. There's some other permissions things that can be used here as well. Right, so if we wanted to create a service account and use this as an Ldap bind user, for example, or if we want to just make this an admin or pseudo user across all devices, we'll look at this in a bit more detail later, but we can configure this at the individual device level as well if a user is bound to multiple devices. If we did want to set up multi-factor for this user, we can enforce that as well, and then we can also set a grace period, right, or an enrollment period. So that way, the user is not required to set up their MFA the first time login. They have a little bit of a window. That's particularly valuable if you're onboarding a large group of new users all in one fell swoop. So I see this most commonly in education, right? K through 12 and higher ed and things like that. So those are some of the options there. Okay. So, and you can also configure other things like custom attributes and some other stuff too as well. We don't necessarily need to do that right now, so we won't get into it. The password recovery email is a newer feature. This is handy for if you have your email enabled for single sign-on or federated with your IDP. If the user is not able to access their email, then obviously that's not really a viable method for doing password recovery. So you can set up an alternate email for doing that workflow as well. So that's a newer feature, which is pretty handy. All right, we're gonna go ahead and save this user, and we don't need to send the welcome email, so we'll skip that. Okay, so that is some of the basics around user authentication. Let me go back to this user real quick and explain a couple other things. So now that we have an active user, we can see, obviously there hasn't been any activity for this user, and this user is not yet associated with any resources. Again, we'll change that here in a moment, but this is where we would see which devices the user is bound to, which groups they're tied to, and things of that nature as well. The detailed view is basically what we already saw. User groups, which we will use in a moment, is how users get assigned to applications and other resources as well, like Radius authentication or Ldap authentication. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail. But that is one of the methods that you can kind of do role-based access control to assign users to the appropriate resources that they should have access to. This is also where we would see which devices the user is bound to, if any, or we could use this pane to bind a user to a device as well. So we'll come back to that in just a few moments. I'm going to kind of pause for a second, try to catch up on questions here a bit. So if you forget an update from the directory. So Zach has answered some of them here. So let's see. So the agent does need to be deployed on a domain controller, so it won't work with the member server. So that's one of the questions that popped up there. So it does need to be on a DC. The other question about the accidental deletion of an admin, that one's pretty specific. We might need to dive into that one with you offline. That looks like Zach has answered some of the other ones. So we'll kind of go through the flow here, and then what we can do is we'll have plenty of time at the end of the session as well, where we can kind of open it up for a bit more discussion and do some more in-depth Q&A also. Okay, so I have user created, but not assigned to any resources yet. What I'm gonna do now is kind of switch gears a bit and talk through devices and device management. And what we'll do is we'll actually walk through the process together of installing the Jumpcloud agent on a Windows device in this case. And so that we can kind of see what the installation flow looks like and what those options are. And then we will, once that device is set up, we'll actually bind that device to the user that we just created, so we can kind of see what that full flow looks like end to end. So the first thing that you notice here on the device's homepage is just kind of an overview of the fleet distribution and current operating system patch levels that are deployed in your environment. So this is all part of a brand new feature that we've just released, or rather it's still in early access, but expected to go generally available soon, is patch management, right? So the ability to automate OS patches for your fleet through the Jumpcloud admin console, and by having the Jumpcloud agent on your endpoints. So again, this is just kind of an overview of what the distribution looks like, and we'll take a closer look at the actual policies which control this in just a moment. But in terms of the devices page, this will show us all of the current devices which are in the environment, and you can filter by device type or operating system, or whether or not it's encrypted, and a few other things of that nature. And you can also perform some bulk actions here as well if you want to. So I'll just pull up an existing device, which I already have, so we can kind of take a look at that. And so on the main device homepage, this is kind of the highlights. It'll show us things like the users that are bound to the device, any unmanaged profiles that are on that device. And so again, the way that this works is that when you install the Jumpcloud agent on the device, that by itself doesn't necessarily do much, right? You've not yet bound a user to it. And so when we bind a user, a local profile user, to Jumpcloud, we're going to be looking for that username attribute. So does the existing local profile name match the Jumpcloud username? If it does, we'll just take over that local profile, right, or merge that account basically. Otherwise, if it does not, right, so if the Jumpcloud username does not match a local machine profile username, then we'll just create a new user profile on that device. So that's the flow that we'll look at today as if we're setting up a brand new device. The other thing I'll call attention to here is that this is also where you can enable device MFA. And so this is a really big deal these days, especially if you or your clients are looking to get cybersecurity insurance. This is basically becoming a mandatory requirement for cybersecurity insurance carriers, that they want MFA on everything basically, and so that's something that's a critical capability that we have. This is also where you would find the security commands, right? So if a user leaves the device in an airport or in a Starbucks or whatnot, you can lock it, shut down, erase, do those types of things remotely, which is pretty cool. And then other things, this is where you can also see which device groups this device belongs to. And that's just a way of enforcing multiple policies in bulk. And policies, you can kind of see some of the popular ones here, right? Full disk encryption is probably the most popular policy that you can use Jumpcloud to enforce. Disable removable media, screen timeout settings, that type of thing. Or even custom welcome messages on the machine as well, which we'll be able to see in a second here. Okay, so let's actually go through the process of setting up a new device, and so I'll show you what that flow looks like. So depending on the operating system that you have in your environments, there's a few different methods to actually get the agent installed on a machine. So for Windows, you have kind of just the agent download here. You can distribute to users. So you can download it and provide the connect key. You can provide a download link to users. There's also a PowerShell method as well, right? So if you've already got remote access to that device, this is probably the easiest method to use. It also includes the connect key, and the connect key essentially is what authorizes that agent's connection to this specific Jumpcloud instance, right? So that connect key will be unique for each organization. So if you're managing multiple organizations, then each one will have a unique connect key. So that's something that's important to remember. Speaking of managing multiple organizations, I kind of neglected to start off by showing the multi-tenant portal. So I'll make sure to cover that after we've done the deep dive of kind of a single Jumpcloud organization. We'll look at how the multi-tenant portal can help you manage multiple Jumpcloud organizations under one kind of management console. So we'll come back to that later. So that's kind of the methods for Windows. For Mac, you have some pretty cool options, including zero-touch enrollment. So if you already have Apple Business Manager, and maybe you use the Apple Device Enrollment Program, you can have that stuff integrated into Jumpcloud, so you can do full zero-touch enrollment using MDM Enrollment Profile. And that's the best way to do it for Mac, because that does give you all of these capabilities. There are a couple other methods, but you're far more limited in capabilities when it comes to these types of methods. And this is primarily because of the changes that Apple made with, I think it was Big Sur, where they basically require you to use an MDM profile to do some of these more advanced capabilities. And so that's the recommended approach to do that. But it does require you to configure ABM, right, which is, you'll find this in the MDM section, right? So there's a process to configure a certificate chain and stuff like that. Relatively straightforward, and there's tons of videos and knowledge-based articles on how to set that up. But if you're looking in your environment and you don't see that MDM profile enrollment option, it's because you've not yet set up the MDM enrollment stuff here. Okay, so for this example, we're just kind of going to do it the simplest of ways, and we're going to just manually install the Windows agent on a virtual machine that I have. One of the other options that I didn't mention is that you can also enable it for self-service, meaning a user could sign into their Jumpcloud user console and they can download the agent from their own user console and install it that way. So this is basically a brand new Windows 11 virtual machine. There's one local admin user on this machine, just this J Herbert one. But beyond that, there's no other Jumpcloud managed users on this device. And so what we're going to do is we're going to install the agent, run through the install wizard, and set it up that way, and see what that process looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And this will take a couple minutes to go through this, so I'll kind of walk through and skip back and forth a little bit while we're doing some of these things. But the wizard approach is fairly straightforward, right? Even if you're doing the self-install, it's relatively easy to follow, right? Really, the only thing that it'll ask the user to do is to paste in that connect key. Again, if you've already got remote access to the machine, PowerShell is the easier method to use because it doesn't require user intervention. Or, of course, if you're shipping, if you have a new machine that you're unboxing and you're shipping out to the user, then you as an administrator can set this stuff up before you do that, of course. And then once the user gets it, then they'll already be ready to go. All right, so that's going to do its thing. So again, like I said, what we're going to do in this particular instance is, we just created that new user, which I called, what was it, James.training, right? And what we'll do is once we get that agent installed and that machine reporting back up to Jumpcloud, we're going to bind this user to that device. And because this username does not exist on that device yet, it's going to create a brand new local profile for us. Again, if we wanted to merge with an existing local profile, just make sure that the username matches up and you'll be good to go. And the other thing I'll talk about here too while we're waiting for this to get fired up is the agent works on basically a 60-second heartbeat. So every minute it's going to be checking in with Jumpcloud to see if there's any new work to be done, right? Work meaning any configuration changes that you made in the admin interface, or new policies that you decided to enforce, or new commands that you wanted to run on that device, anything like that. And I'll talk more about what policies and commands mean in a second here once we get through the install. But that 60-second heartbeat is the basic principle of how it gets new work. Okay, so agent is installed. We're good to go. That's all ready. If we come over to our devices here, I'm just going to refresh this page, and we should see that new device just came online. So let's take a look here. There we go. It should be this guy, I believe. Let's actually check. This was a device restored from snapshot, so it might be getting confused with the other existing device that was already there as well. There we go. Okay, so this is one. So we can see it just checked in a few seconds ago. It was our last contact there. We see it's online and reporting back to Jumpcloud. So this is that device that we just got that agent installed on. And as you can see, no users bound to that device yet. There's no other unmanaged profiles that it has visibility into, no device groups, no policies, anything like that. So what we will start by doing is binding a user to that device, right? So I'm gonna go back to this James training user, and I'm gonna go ahead and bind this user to this device. And this is where we can define the privileges for the user on this particular device if we want to, right? So, we can define this at the group level, we can define it at the user level across all devices, or we can define it at the individual device level as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and save this device. And so within a minute, sometimes less, it will create that new profile for us on this device. And so we'll give that a sec to do that. And then basically what that's allowing us to do is now we can sign into that device using the Jumpcloud credentials for that user, right? So again, Jumpcloud is authoritative over the user credentials, so the user can sign into that device using their JC account, their Jumpcloud account. So that can take up to 2 minutes, so we'll let it do its thing here for a sec. Let's see. Multiple local account mappings for, so there's a question here, will there ever be a way to have multiple local account mappings for a user that has multiple OS devices? If I think I'm understanding the question correctly, I'll go back to the user view. If I look at the devices that this particular user has, right, if I refresh now, we'll see that this user is bound to that Windows device. But I could also bind this user to multiple other devices as well, right? So this user could have a Mac OS device, could have multiple Windows devices, could have Linux. So you can have a user bound to multiple devices where they use that same credential across those various different devices. And that's just controlled here from this kind of user device associations here. So hopefully that answers your question about having a user bound to multiple OSs. Okay, let's check back in here and see. Not quite yet. So it looks like it's taken the full 2 minutes this time around. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. Let's come back over here and see. The other thing I can point out while we're waiting for that to happen is the system insights. So system insights is somewhat new, I suppose, but this is a really cool feature that allows you to see all kinds of different information about that device. So including things like hardware information, operating system, of course, patch level, serial number of the device, and a ton of other information about that particular device that you can kind of see here. And you can also filter by specific info, also even go so far as to look at things like Chrome extensions installed as well. Okay. All right, let's see if this is ready to go yet. Okay, so there we go. So we have that new profile that's now set up. So this James training profile was automatically created on this device. And so now we'll be able to sign into this profile using the same password that I set up for this user when I initially created them. Cool, so first time authentication, user signing into that device now with the Jumpcloud credential. All right, and so while that does its thing, I'll kind of circle back over to user groups. So, so we now have a user who's bound to a device so that user can sign into that device using their Jumpcloud credential. So they have access to that one resource, right, that one device, but what about other resources like applications and things like that? And that is where the user groups come into play. And so from the user object here, I can assign the user to a variety of different user groups, but let's actually take a look at the user group itself, and so we can see what types of resources that we can assign to that. I'm trying to look at some of these questions as well. Okay. Looks like Zach is trying to get to him, so I'll let him play catch up a bit on some of those. So I'm going to look at this user group here, this one called engineering. And so there's a few different things here that we can do with user groups. First off, we can assign user groups to device groups, right? So giving a member of a user group access to all of the devices that belong to a device group. We can assign applications to these user groups, which is really what facilitates access management from a single sign-on perspective, as well as user lifecycle management for a user provisioning perspective, right? So you can see all of the various different applications here that are already configured in this Jumpcloud org, and we can see, selected which applications are assigned to this particular user group. We could also assign, we could also bind user groups to Radius servers, right? So for VPN authentication or Wi-Fi access point authentication, or to directories, right? So if we want to synchronize members of this user group out to other remote directories, then that can be done through user groups as well. For right now, we're just going to focus on the applications piece of it, and then we'll kind of circle back to Ldap and Radius as well. So for this particular example, for this user group, we can see that AWS has been configured here, and it also shows us which pieces of functionality that these specific applications support. So in this case, identity management is one of them. And that essentially means that this application supports the SCIM protocol, which allows for automated user provisioning. So we can create users, update users, delete users, and in most cases, assign entitlements as well, things like a role or group membership within that downstream application. So what does this all mean? Let me come back over to the virtual machine here where I'm signed in as James Training. I'm going to go ahead and sign into the Jumpcloud user console and get rid of this stuff. Okay, so we're going to go to console.jumpcloud.com. All right, I'm going to sign in as that new user. Okay. So first things first is it's telling me that I need to set up multi-factor authentication because when I created this user as an administrator, I did set that value. And it does also tell me that I have 6 days remaining to set this up. I'm gonna go ahead and do it now so that y'all can see what the actual setup process looks like. So we do have support for several different authentication factors. I think this was a question in the chat as well earlier. So we can support pretty much any TOTP authenticator. So Google Authenticator, things of that nature. We do have our own Jumpcloud Protect application as well, which does support TOTP and mobile push. For now, I'm just going to do the TOTP so that y'all can see what that looks like. And so first, it gives the user some instructions on what to do, right? Go and download the Jumpcloud Protect application or any other authenticator app if they prefer. Right, I have an app, and then it gives me this QR code to scan. So in my application, I'm just going to hit the plus button, scan that QR code, and then I just have to enter in the actual OTP. Oops. All right, and so that's going to enroll my device and then basically satisfy that requirement, right? So now I have TOTP enrolled, and so I'm good to go. The other option that you noticed on there beyond just TOTP and mobile push was WebAuthn. So WebAuthn is a bit newer protocol. It's really centered around biometrics. And so for devices which have kind of native hardware that's enabled for biometrics, so think of a MacBook Pro with the Touch ID, Windows Hello with the Face ID or Face Reader, whatever they call it. Those are the types of factors that can use the WebAuthn protocol. The other really popular one for WebAuthn is hardware security tokens. So YubiKey, Google Titan, things of that nature. So that's also supported as an authentication factor. Okay, so notice here that, so this user is signed into the console, but they don't have any access to any applications, right? Because I haven't assigned any applications to this user yet. And so that's kind of where the magic happens here. So if I come back to the user object, right, I'm back at James Training, the user object, I'm gonna bind this user to the user group. And I'm just gonna go ahead and save this. And so this is gonna do a couple things. It's gonna kick off kind of a workflow on the back end to not only grant access to all of the applications that were configured in that user group, but for the applications which have user provisioning configured, it's also going to automatically create the users in those downstream applications, right? So we have that configured for AWS, and we'll show what that looks like, right? So as soon as I refresh, now we can see all the applications that I've been assigned to. So any of these apps that are configured to use single sign-on, provided that the user already exists in that downstream application, they'll be able to sign in here right away, which again, that's kind of the beauty of SCIM. But also something that you need to be aware of is that for applications that do not support that SCIM protocol, the user still needs to be manually created so that they have a matching identity. But in the case of AWS, we have that configured, and so I can click on AWS, I get SAML SSO into AWS console, and I'm good to go, right? So just by assigning that user to a user group, granted me access to the application and also provisioned me into that application, so I'm therefore able to sign in. Right. Okay, so looks like Zach is staying on top of questions, so thanks, Zach, for your diligence. But love the participation. Keep firing away at the questions, guys. All right, so what have we done so far? So we've created a new user. We've installed the Jumpcloud agent onto a Windows device. We've bound the user to that Windows device. We've bound the user to a user group. So, that's kind of a good example of a mostly complete flow of how you'd go about setting a new user, new device, and kind of giving them access to different resources that they need. So let's take a moment now and let's take a closer look at device management, and we'll look at some of the other different capabilities there. And then we'll kind of take a deeper dive into some of the things like the single sign-on and identity management configurations. And then we can talk about some other types of user authentication as well. So let's come back to devices for a moment. So one of the things, again, I want to point out is that the system insights capability, right? And one of the best parts about Jumpcloud is that we kind of bring together the user identity and the device, right? So of course, if you're familiar with traditional directory setups like On-Prem AD, that's probably pretty standard for you. But if you are kind of mainly familiar with more modern technologies, you kind of have all these different disparate systems for user and device management, right? Where maybe you've got several different point solutions, one for SSO, one for device management, one for Ldap, one for Radius, one for multi-factor authentication, right? You probably have 5 or 6 different point solutions that are kind of doing all of those things for you, which is really the best part about Jumpcloud, is that it kind of brings all of those solutions together into a single platform where you can manage users, manage devices, manage user authentication, multi-factor authentication. But also as a result of that, you have really robust insights into what that user is doing at any given time, right? When they're logging into a device, when they're logging into an application, et cetera, right? So you have all of that event trail or that kind of audit history that you can utilize as well. And again, we'll cover that in a bit more detail once we get to the directory insights, which is kind of the broader, more high-level insights. So a couple other important things around devices are device groups and policies, right? So policies, for starters, are just a way of enforcing machine-level policies, right? So again, think of things like full disk encryption, screen timeout, whether or not you want to allow the camera to be utilized, things like that, right? So if we look at something, say for example, we wanted to enable disk encryption on this machine, we can either check that box right there and enforce that policy. So you can kind of do it a couple different ways, right? You can manually kind of enable these selected policies, or what you can do is you can just assign the device to a device group. And the device group is essentially a collection of several different policies together, right? So you can kind of set up all your different policies and create a device group, and that way you just have to assign that device to a group and therefore enforce all of the policies that way. So if we look at the actual, I'll kind of go to the policy catalog here so you can see what that looks like. So there's several different pre-built or default policies, right? You'll notice that some of them are for Windows, some for Linux, some for Mac. Again, if we look at kind of the most popular ones, for Mac, that's going to be File Vault, full disk encryption, for Windows, BitLocker. In either of those scenarios, one of the really nice things is that Jumpcloud actually generates and holds the recovery key in escrow, right? So if you ever need to recover that disk, you have an easy way to manage and get access to it, right? So you don't have to walk the user through that process of doing it locally or remote into the machine and sign into a local admin profile and do it that way. You can just kind of do it easily from the Jumpcloud console because we hold that recovery key in escrow. So again, you'll see default policies for things like File Vault where you can enforce that. And you have some other different settings here that you can enable. And again, this is where you would assign it to either a device group or assign it to specific devices if you wanted to as well. For Windows, if we take a look at those ones, same types of things. We're looking at disk encryption is probably the most popular thing that you would want to have from a security standpoint for your devices. But there's other, other stuff here as well, right? Again, like things like screen timeout, disable USB storage, control panel display, um, restricting control panel access. All these different types of things are possible. And if you want to get a bit more advanced, you can also configure your own custom reg keys. So that's here as well. So you can get a bit more detailed and use some more advanced stuff here as well if you want to. The other thing I'll point out while we're here is you may have seen this flash up a moment ago is that we do have iOS policies here as well. That's because we now support iOS device management. And so that's a relatively new feature for us also. And it's kind of our first foray into, bring your own device. And currently today it works with iOS. In the future, it'll work for Android as well. You'll notice there's not as many policies available here, but these will be growing in the future. And this is also partially the method in which we're using for iOS device management. So you don't have quite as many controls as you would on like a full-blown Mac OS device because of the method that we're using there. But for iOS, it does use an MDM enrollment profile. So if you're familiar with that, it's similar setup. But say we wanted to, for example, just enforce something like this policy to the device, you can do that easily here as well. All right. So policies are kind of an easy way that you can utilize this kind of existing library of stuff to deploy these policies out to machines. While I'm here, I'll briefly talk about the patch management policies as well. So that patch management capability is controlled through policies, and basically this gives you the ability to kind of enforce when you would like the OS patches to go out to users, right? And whether or not you'd like to have a grace period before it forces the user. So you can kind of set that up here, and you might have different user populations, right? Like this is the general adoption one. Depending on the severity of the patch, you might want to adjust your grace periods for different cohorts of users that way. But relatively simple setup here to actually create these policies. Okay, so the other thing that's a key functionality for device management is commands. The way that I like to think about commands is, policies is kind of your default or pre-built library of things that you can do for machines. Commands kind of fills in the gaps, right? Anything that's maybe not available in the policy library, it might be a good use case for a command. The easiest way to think about commands, or the easiest way I kind of think about commands is, if you can script it, you can do it with the command. It's kind of intuitive in the sense that it's the ability to run commands on the machine as if you're using terminal or PowerShell or whatever on that local machine, right? And so again, if you can write it in PowerShell or Bash or Python, you can do it with commands. You can run these manually on a schedule as repeating or on a trigger. You can configure the timeout. Which is handy because depending on what you're trying to do, you might need to lengthen the timeout for certain things. And you can even use this to do things like install packages, right, in some of the more advanced use cases, right? Because we do have kind of a software management capability here built in, right? So if you wanted to remotely install software to machines, you can do this with software management. But in some cases, this may not be the most applicable approach, and maybe if it's a custom package, for example, that you want to deploy to a machine, then commands might be a better way of doing that. For Windows, this relies on Chocolatey. So for example, if we look at Adobe here, this is kind of the standard one, right? But again, it relies on Chocolatey as kind of the public repo to pull these packages from. You can also use, like if we wanted to create our own custom package, you could. And so basically, as long as there's a publicly callable repo URL, then it's possible. So you could host your own custom packages somewhere. As long as there's a publicly accessible URL, then you can still pull those down to machines as well. Okay, so then again, so for Windows, that relies on Chocolatey. For Apple, that utilizes the Apple Volume Purchase Program, which you can set up through your Apple Business Manager. Okay, so I think that kind of covers all the stuff for devices, device management. We looked at policies, policy groups, commands, software management. Let me take a quick look over some of the questions here to see if I'm missing anything. Again, looks like Zach is on top of it here. Yeah. So AD migration tool, yeah, that I don't know if that's necessarily a question, but yeah, in addition to the Active Directory import agent and the Active Directory sync agent, we do also have an Active Directory migration utility as well, or ADMU. That's effectively designed for devices which are currently bound to an Active Directory domain that you'd like to migrate off of the domain to Jumpcloud. So that is what that is used for. Is there a link to the LastPass demo app? We can take a look in the catalog and see that in just a second. Let's see. Some of these are not questions. Okay, we'll keep moving. Looks like Zach is getting to these as well. Okay, so let's look at, we'll take a closer look at user authentication, right? So this is one of the questions that popped up. So when it comes to user authentication, at least for web-based applications, we can integrate with anything that supports the SAML standard, right? So if it supports SAML 2.0, then we'll be able to integrate with it. We do have an existing catalog that has about 700 pre-configured applications, 748 to be exact. So like, if we look for LastPass, I'm not sure if we actually do or not. Looks like we don't, but in that type of scenario, we could configure a custom SAML application. So again, as long as the application supports it, we can support it. For these custom applications, the easiest way to configure these is if you're able to obtain the service provider metadata. That's the easiest way to set this up because you can just import the service provider metadata into Jumpcloud. And then most of the stuff like the ACS URL, SPNC ID would be pre-populated for you. In some cases, the service provider won't provide the actual metadata. They might just provide the individual URLs or URIs instead, which is also fine, right? As long as we have the service provider metadata or the information contained within the metadata, then we'll be able to configure it here. And then once you actually provide a couple values here for things like IDP entity ID, when you activate this application, that's what will generate the IDP metadata, right? So for example, if I wanted to just say, I'm just going to call this Jumpcloud, I think that's the only one that's required. Activate. Oh, I need IDP URL. Oh, it does require the SPNC ID as well. Well, for quick demo purposes here, just going to make one up. And I might need the ACS too. Okay, let's do this instead. We'll look at an existing app and see how that works. So let's just use the AWS example, right? So now in the case of the applications which are already in the catalog, most of this stuff is already filled out for you. So things like the attribute information here, like anything that's specific to that particular application, right? In most cases, things like the assertion consumer service URL will be kind of dynamic for each individual tenant, right? Like your subdomain.slack.com, for example. Some applications just use a static, static endpoints for their SAML configuration. But basically, the bottom line is that the idea behind having the pre-built catalog connectors is that we take out some of the guesswork and pre-populate some of those values for you already. And then kind of by way of having a catalog connector, that also means that we'll have a knowledge base article that you can link to from the top there. And in a lot of cases, we'll have videos that correspond to these knowledge base articles as well. But anyways, it'll show you how to set up the configuration on both the Jumpcloud side and also on the service provider side. So it's a good resource to use. But notice here that we've activated this particular connector. So if we wanted to, we could export the Jumpcloud metadata. Excuse me. Most service providers do allow you to import metadata, so you can just provide to them this XML file and import the IDP metadata into the service provider to set up the SAML configuration there. For the applications which support identity management, you'll have this option here as well. Again, we're using that SCIM standard to create, update, delete users, and assign entitlements. So again, that's what really allows you to do that automated user provisioning to create users in those downstream applications. So, you know, every application, when it comes to SAML SSO, every application has a slightly different way that they actually go about configuring it. For the most part, it's the same, right? Fundamentally, we're exchanging SAML metadata between the IDP and the SP, but the actual process to do it can differ a little bit from one application to the next. So, you know, handy to have like the knowledge base articles and the videos available, that type of a thing. But in some cases, like if you're setting up a custom SAML application, and you know, obviously if you're an expert in SAML, it's probably easy for you, but there are a few things that tend to be a little bit tricky sometimes when setting up SAML, like the names of certain attributes kind of tend to have a couple different names for the same thing sometimes. So just something to be aware of, but you know, we have technical resources here that can help you with this type of stuff as well. Okay, so that is basics with SAML SSO. There's a question here, will this session be recorded? Yes, it is being recorded. I believe we are gonna send it out to attendees after the fact as well. All right, what else? We can look at Ldap and Radius. So Ldap and Radius are both relatively easy to set up on the Jumpcloud side, and there's really not much to set up on the Jumpcloud side for either of these. You know, we provide a cloud-hosted Ldap endpoint, and we also provide a cloud-hosted Radius endpoint. So, you know, any applications or appliances or other resources that you have that support either of those protocols, you can just configure them to point to the Jumpcloud servers, and that's pretty much it. Most of the configuration is handled on the appliance side. So if we look at Ldap, most common use cases for Ldap would be things like NAS, right? So Synology, QNAP, network attached storage in general, or sometimes applications, right? Maybe legacy applications. You know, think of things like On-Prem Jira, Confluence, right? Those types of things would support Ldap natively, but they may not support SAML natively. And so basically, you know, we provide to you kind of your distinguished name, your org-dn, right? And so you would use this combined with that Ldap bind user I was referring to earlier, right? So you create a service account that's used as the Ldap bind user, and that's effectively used to perform bind and search requests. And then you would use this as the base DN. But this is a fully RFC 2307 compliant Ldap server. So anything that is compliant with that RFC will be supported here. Also supports Samba Authentication for things that utilize that. So again, it's relatively easy to set up, and basically on whichever end, you know, whatever type of application or whatever that you're configuring, you do most of the configuration on that side. You'd point it to the Jumpcloud Ldap servers, provide that bind user service account, and that's pretty much it. Similarly with Radius, it's kind of a similar type of setup, right? Where you can set up these individual Radius configurations. You have a shared secret, which is shared between Jumpcloud and the appliance or the thing that's making these requests, and then basically just provide the IP address that your appliance is going to be making these requests from. So most popular use cases for Radius would be things like VPN, right? So enabling multi-factor authentication for VPN is pretty popular. And for Radius is kind of a funny one, right? Because for VPN in particular, a lot of the VPN services or clients are now starting to support SAML authentication, right? So instead of doing the kind of traditional VPN client where you just type in your username and password and then maybe MFA, if you're using SAML authentication with an SSL VPN, then they're basically doing like an embedded web browser within the client, or they might just launch a browser tab for you to do the authentication there. And that's essentially where you would, you go to authenticate to the VPN. It will redirect the user to the Jumpcloud sign-in page. They enter in their credentials there, perform the multi-factor challenge if that's enabled, and then they're connected to the VPN. So it presented the choice. If you have VPN that supports both SAML or Radius, I think Radius is probably the easier setup. It's also more of a unified user experience because the actual authentication workflow that the user sees when signing into Radius, when signing into the VPN would look basically the same as if they were signing into any other application. So that's there's something to be said about that. And I think generally speaking, SAML is a little bit easier to set up too. But kind of a preference thing. Radius is plenty secure. There's not really any concern there, but it does somewhat depend on your VPN appliance and what specific authentication schemes it supports. Right, you'll notice down here there's kind of an important note that MS chat can't be used with TOTP. Right, so for example, if you do want to enforce MFA over Radius, but your appliance only supports MS chat, for example, then it's not going to work. Right, so maybe SAML is the alternative to that. MFA, by the way, TOTP MFA will work with eTTLS authentication too. So, and most appliances support kind of all of those or both, but you might have a specific VPN type that only supports one protocol, so you might be limited in choices there. But anyways, if given the choice, I think SAML is a bit easier to configure and again, more unified user experience also. Okay, so that's kind of all things user authentication. You'll also notice that for Radius in particular, you can have several different Radius configurations here, maybe for different physical locations or things of that nature. I should also point out that I talked about VPN. The other use case for Radius is Wi-Fi, right? So if you wanted to set up 802.1x authentication for your Wi-Fi access points, where instead of having a shared Wi-Fi password that everybody uses to connect, your users are actually then allowed to use their Jumpcloud username and password to authenticate to that Wi-Fi network. So more secure approach there. You don't have to worry about changing out that password anytime somebody leaves the company and things like that. So that's the other pretty popular use case for Radius. Things like Meraki, Ubiquiti, those ones are supported and documented. On the VPN side, kind of the usual suspects, right? So Cisco, Meraki, with any Connect, of course, Palo Alto Global Protect, Zscaler, all those types of things are supported. Okay, so that's kind of the first part of user authentication. The other part of user authentication, at least with respect to authentication into applications and the Jumpcloud user console, is conditional access policies. So this is a way to just have more granular security controls over how a user authenticates into the applications which are protected by Jumpcloud. And this is really kind of introducing the concept of zero trust access. I know zero trust is a bit of a buzzword, but if you think about kind of the fundamentals of what it means, right? You're looking at the user identity, right? So authenticating the user in a secure fashion. You're looking at the device, right? Is that a secure device? Do I trust that device? Do I know that it has antivirus on it and that's on the latest patch, right? That device and security on the device. And then network, right? So is that a trusted network? Is it a non-trusted network? Are they on my VPN? Are they on my corporate network? Those types of things, right? So if you look at it through that lens where it's user, device, and network, and how do I ensure that I have a reasonable level of assurance around all three of those aspects before deciding how or if I'd like to allow that user to access that application, that's really kind of how we're looking at this here. And so if we look at an example, we'll take a look at a couple different examples. We can kind of set up one on our own as well, right? So this is one that's already been set up here, which basically just denies users access if they're on a personal device, right? So this one is fairly common. You only want users to sign into applications if they're on a managed device because you have, again, assurance about that device. You know that it's got your policies enforced on it. Maybe you've got MFA enforced on that device as well. You know what patch it's on, whether or not it has AV, and all those types of things, right? So this is a fairly common one. And basically, we can determine which users we want to enforce this policy for. So, we can say just all users, or we can just choose selected groups of users that we want to include in this. We could use an exclusion method instead if we wanted to, so you can use inclusion or exclusion method here. And then you can specify your conditions, right? So in this case, we're requiring that the user is on a Jumpcloud managed device. You can also enforce location or countries, right? So for this particular policy, we're saying users can only sign in from the United States, right? So we're saying if you are a user who belongs to this remote workers user group, you're on a Jumpcloud managed device and you're within the US, then having analyzed all those conditions, we will allow you to authenticate, but also require multi-factor authentication, right? We could choose other actions here if we wanted to as well, right? Like allow authentication without MFA or deny access altogether, right? So that's, again, just one example. If we look at another example, and this is one that I see pretty often as well, is kind of doing a step-up authentication for specific applications, right? So like in this case, we're looking at specific application instead of the entire user console. We're still looking at a specific group of users. And for context here, so this is a policy for users who are accessing an AWS production environment, right? We want to require them to be on a trusted device and be on the VPN for accessing the production environment. So we're just enforcing it for that one application, only enforcing it for that one group of users, the DevOps group, and the conditions are similar, right? We want to make sure that they're on a Jumpcloud managed device, and we want to make sure that they're on a trusted network. And so what this is looking at here is the IP lists, or the conditional lists rather. So I'll pop that open real quick. This is basically the ability to kind of create your list of IPs or your ranges once, and then you can just reuse them over and over again. So you don't have to copy and paste 20 different IP ranges every time you want to create a conditional policy. You just create the list once, put your range in here, and then you can just reuse that same list over and over again. So that's what this is referring to right here, where you can just choose which list of IPs that you want to enforce for this particular policy. Okay. So again, this one's saying you're on a trusted device, you're on the corporate VPN, and we're still going to require multi-factor, but provided you can meet all those 3 criteria, we'll allow authentication. So that's an example there. And I've seen that type of example used for maybe HIPAA applications, right? If you have clients in the medical space who have like electronic medical records and that type of thing, maybe you want to always make sure that MFA is enforced and it's only accessible from a trusted device for those types of applications, right? So you can kind of pick and choose if you want to enforce those for particular applications, for the entire console, or choose whichever conditions that you like. And relatively easy to set up, where you can just kind of select those conditions and select the action that you want to take. Okay, I'm gonna take a quick pause. Looks like the questions are slowing down. So, and we probably won't use the full 2 hours here, folks. I think we'll be wrapped up within the next 20 minutes or so. So probably around the 90-minute mark is about when I think we'll finish. A couple other things here that I'll quickly cover. You have some global configurations here that you can set up. This is where you would enable the different types of authentication factors that you'd like to allow. So you might not want to allow WebAuthn, for example. We do also have integration with Duo Security. So if you're already using Duo Security in your environment, we can enable that here as well. So you can set that up. And of course, Jumpcloud Protect and then TOTP also. The user security settings is kind of more around global password settings, right? So password complexity, age, originality, these types of things. Also lockout attempts, right? So do you want to lock users out if they exceed some number of invalid login attempts? And those are kind of some of the basic things. Your general organization profile, configuring administrators here, and really some basic stuff there. So directory insights. So this is kind of bringing it all back together. So directory insights, again, is because we have the user identity that we're managing, the device that we're managing, and all of the various different resources that user may need to access, means you have a single consolidated view of all of the activity happening within your organization. And so you can kind of see, just based on the graph here, the peak levels of activity. You could drill into any of these specific time ranges if you want to see all of the events that are happening during that specific time range. Of course, look at all the specific events here that are happening. If we wanted to drill into any of these, we can look at kind of the general description to see, okay, what happened? Where was that user signing in from? What were they specifically doing? And this is kind of the friendly, human readable version, if you will. If you want to see the actual raw JSON, then we provide that as well. You do also have the ability to look at either saved views, right? So for example, failed system login attempts, if you want to look at those, there's none in that time range. So let's just wipe this out or change that to today. Still no failed login attempts, pretty good, right? So if we look at last 30 days, maybe now we can see some failed login attempts, right? So again, we can kind of see what's going on here. Maybe you want to look at, okay, well, this person's in California. This person doesn't live in California. Maybe that's a red flag, right? So you can really drill into these events and get a better understanding of what's going on in your environment that way, right? So you can look at different event types, different systems, different users, lots of different filters available in the timestamps, of course. You have a few different ways that you can export these events. So you can do it directly here from the console. You can either export in JSON or CSV format. If you're an AWS user, we also do have an AWS S3, I guess, application you'd call it, which can automatically sync events from Jumpcloud and dump them into an S3 bucket. There's also an API for this stuff as well, right? So if you wanted to kind of build out your own custom integration with the SIM tool, for example, then that would be possible through the API. So that's directory insights. And then reports is relatively new. This is basically kind of a few standard reports that are mainly centered around associations, right? So user to devices, user to directories, things like that. So you can pull this out and kind of use this to make sure that you have a full holistic picture of what's happening within your environment as well. Cool, so I think that's most of the stuff that I wanted to go into for the individual org level. I'll kind of switch or kind of go back to the start to look at what the multi-tenant portal looks like, right, which is really designed around MSPs. So let me go ahead and do that. I'm going to sign out of this one. I'm going to log into a different portal here. Let's go here and then give me just a moment. Okay, so multi-tenant portal. So this is, again, designed specifically for MSPs. And so I'll say that especially within the last year, I mean, Jumpcloud has kind of always been a great tool for MSPs, but especially across the last year, we've invested quite a lot into just the MSP business and our partnerships with those organizations as a whole. And you're going to see more of that moving forward into the future as well. But one of the key things here is the multi-tenant portal, right? So this is basically allows you to have kind of a hierarchy structure. So, you know, as an MSP, obviously you've got multiple different clients that you are, that you're servicing. And so you can have, you know, many different independent Jumpcloud organizations that are kind of associated to the multi-tenant portal, right? So think of the MTP as kind of like the super admin that oversees all of the child organizations below it. So at first glance, you know, one of the key things here is you can see how many users you have within each of these organizations, right? And I'll come back to that in just a moment. You can also easily launch into any of these specific organizations, right? So if I wanted to get into this one here, Demo Jumpcloudia, I can launch into this one. And, you know, now I'm signed into this specific org where everything else that we saw, you know, up until this point is the same, right? So this is a unique Jumpcloud instance. You know, it just happens to be a child of the multi-tenant portal. I could easily switch to another instance if I wanted to. based on the permissions that have been assigned, which I'll show you in just a sec, or I can jump back over to the MTP as well. So speaking of permissions, when you create administrators in the MTP, you can define the specific permissions that they're going to have, right? So you'd give a first name, last name, email, and then you can say, okay, this user is going to be an administrator of all of my organizations, or you can say, okay, well, this user is only going to administer these 2 clients, right? So depending on how your organization is set up, if you've only got a couple techs that just work with everybody, or if you've got a larger team and you have techs that are dedicated to, a handful of customers only, then you can set it up this way so that, techs are only authorized to view and manage the organizations that they specifically have access to. And you can still define the roles as well, so the actual admin role that those individuals have within these organizations. So your admin with billing is basically your super admin that can do everything. Administrator is kind of admin that can do almost everything except for the billing stuff. And then you have some other more granular ones as well. Like help desk tends to be pretty popular, where it's kind of like a read-only for most things, but they can, view and edit user objects, so they can help with password resets or account recovery or MFA, stuff like that, but they can't really modify anything else that's configured within the environment. So you have a few different options there for administrator privileges as well. So that's a couple of the key highlights there. So you have your organization overview, how you set up your administrators, and then coming back over to current users, right? So current users, you can kind of see, and this is really helpful for billing, right? From a billing standpoint. So if you're already a Jumpcloud customer, you probably know that we use the high watermark method for user billing. And we've heard feedback from customers that it can be a bit tedious, still a bit manual to kind of, make sure that you're staying on top of invoicing and stuff like that, especially if your finance team is kind of hounding you every month and how many users do we have, that type of thing. So to help with that, and this is something that's very new, we now can integrate directly with ConnectWise Manage. And so this is really handy because you can kind of help to automate that stuff. And really, if your finance team already has access to ConnectWise Manage, then they don't have to ping you every month and say, hey, how many users are in that customer or whatever. They can just, look into ConnectWise Manage and see the user count that was being synchronized from Jumpcloud. So pretty straightforward to set up. You basically just have to configure a couple items here, and then that'll set up the integration. But the main thing here is that it will synchronize the user count on a nightly basis, right? So you can read all about it here if you want to, but that's really the key thing, is that it synchronizes your user count on a nightly basis. So you can kind of automate that part of it. And so you can always have an accurate number of user counts from Jumpcloud in your ConnectWise Manage portal. So let me pause there and take a bit of a breath. I've been talking quite a bit, but looks like Zach has been firing away all the answers, questions, stuff like that. But yeah, Zach, I'll give you a chance to chime in. Was there anything that I missed, you think, that would be relevant for our partners to know about, whether in the MTP or the individual tenant level? I tried to kind of cover a little bit of everything, but yeah, feel free.
Yeah, I think there's one area, just kind of high level, that I think is interesting. It's sort of asking whether we're a replacement for an RMM. We certainly have a ton of overlap already, but look, it's our goal that our product set is so comprehensive for our MSPs that it's single pane of glass for your entire day of management tasks. So, look for that this year. And James, I mean, if you want to expound on that, but that's where our product's going for our MSPs.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's certainly, an area of interest for us. And, we've been doing these partner boot camps, right? This kind of roadshow thing where we travel to different cities throughout the country and, kind of visit with our partners and prospects and customers face to face. I was doing one of those last week in Raleigh, North Carolina, and our product manager, Gil Langston, who kind of oversees the MSP product organization, was there with us. And that was certainly one of the things that he was talking about. And, we're kind of looking into what we want to do there, right? Like how far into that do we want to foray? But I think having a more robust, capability around RMM and really just being able to remote into a machine, for example, is probably kind of one of the things that I guess you call it like the last remaining puzzle piece, if you will, for how we can kind of fully support MSPs and give them a holistic solution that can kind of address all of their needs. So certainly something that we're looking into. Like I said, we're making a lot of investment into the MSP capabilities in general, right? So like we have ConnectWise today, but we're looking at integrating into other, management platforms as well. So yeah, we're certainly looking into that type of stuff, and we're eager to hear your feedback on those areas as well. Like what specific functionality that you'd like to see, what would be enough for you to get rid of the RMM, and that type of stuff as well. But yeah, again, I think if you go back to comparing Jumpcloud as a holistic platform to several different point solutions, right? Again, you've got SSO, MFA, device management, Radius, Ldap. That RMM thing is kind of that last one. And again, we've already got a lot of capabilities that overlap today, but that actual remote access one is probably the last piece there.
Yeah, and then James, something came up on Kaseya, that goes towards what you were talking about at the end here with integrations. I know we're working on Datto Automate right now. That seems to be the next up, but yeah, kind of dovetailing into what James just said, we're going to be enhancing those integrations, looking at how do we help you? I mean, that end of month billing thing with ConnectWise, that's huge. Getting that true up right. So that's the direction we're going.
Yeah. Cool. Let's see. What's this question here? Not quite sure what this question is indicating here. Like you can certainly bind a user to a device basically any time, but
James, are you looking at that?
That last question there about, originally didn't configure Jumpcloud to bind to the local user account.
Yeah, I think that's okay. I mean, you can add net new users to a machine as long as the agent's there. And you can always do profile takeover by matching the UN and local account name, as James showed earlier. So, not necessary to do it at the first pass. You can always do it later.
Yeah. Okay, let's see here. Regarding onboarding a new org, is O365 still preferred user integration versus local AD or hybrid AD? I assume you mean just in terms of synchronizing the user objects into Jumpcloud. The integration with Azure AD to sync users is certainly a bit easier than doing the integration with On-Prem AD. I think the big thing to kind of be aware of there, or just in general, is that like when it comes to O365 or Azure AD, there's kind of two key integrations there. One is just the synchronization of users, right? You can do initial import from Azure AD into Jumpcloud. You can also provision users from Jumpcloud into Azure AD. And whether or not you enable federation or SSO will have a major impact on kind of the way you go about that. If you're just doing the synchronization, there's not a ton of concern, but again, it goes back to Jumpcloud should be the authoritative directory source once you deploy it, right? So you create new users in Jumpcloud, synchronize them to the O365 environment. If you do enable SSO for O365, then you don't really have a choice anymore after that point. So once SSO is enabled, then users can only be created from Jumpcloud and provisioned to the 365 environment. So that's a consideration to make. So hopefully that's helpful. Yeah, end goal is to dispose of AD entirely. Yeah, and that's what a lot of organizations are moving towards. I've spoken to some customers who, kind of set up the AD integration with the AD import and AD sync agents as kind of a temporary transition period type of setup, and then a lot of organizations will still have. I tend to find that things around like file servers and stuff like that tend to be kind of one of the stickier points, I guess you'd say, that's keeping some organizations on AD. So as organizations move towards things like a network attached storage like Synology and QNAP, those types of things, or maybe even cloud storage or some hybrid of the two, like Ignite or Box, things like that. That tends to be one of the last remaining pieces where you can kind of finally get rid of on-prem AD altogether, and just use Jumpcloud as the primary directory. So we do see customers that will keep the on-prem AD in place for kind of a transition period, and then eventually get rid of it. Funny stories. Last week at that partner bootcamp I was at, one of our customers who was there said that he had planned to decommission his last on-prem AD server. I think this week is what it was planned for, and it was met with applause. So I thought that was pretty funny. Let's see. What functionality benefit of Jumpcloud is lost when using Jumpcloud along with other MDM MAM solution like Intune, Jamf, etc. We have customers that still use like Jamf MDM with Jumpcloud as well, and similar for the others as well. I think it really depends on like what your specific MDM needs are, but the Jumpcloud agent, at least if we look at the Jamf scenario, Jumpcloud agent can absolutely run alongside Jamf, where Jumpcloud can control the machine authentication, right? So the actual login to the device itself. We have Jamf managing the actual MDM piece and machine policies, right? With Intune, it's a little bit trickier because I believe that for Intune, the machine has to be bound to Azure AD, or at least hybrid bound to it, which would effectively make the Jumpcloud agent not compatible, because you have basically one authoritative source that the machine is handling authentication against, right? It's either authenticating against Jumpcloud or it's authenticating against Azure AD, right? In that scenario. So not sure if it works as well alongside of Intune, but I don't know, Zach, if you have any insights there on working alongside of Intune. It's not that common that I know of.
Yeah, it doesn't come up a lot. We see requests coming in to migrate off of Intune and what that looks like, but seldom do we get can we play alongside Intune. Generally, it becomes a path of cost effectiveness and single pane of glass.
Yeah, and consolidation, I think, is another big piece of that too. And I think particularly, if you have clients who are in, have mixed environments, right? They have Windows, they have Mac, they have Linux. That's where Jumpcloud is going to have the best value. It might be tougher to fit Jumpcloud into an environment that's 100% Windows. So that's just kind of something just to be aware of. And, for sake of full transparency, the mixed environments are going to be where we really excel. Let's see. Is there a way to get mobile push to work with other applications? Not really. TOTP will work with other applications, but mobile push is really only going to work with Jumpcloud. When we make changes, is there local to verify logs through another question? If I undo the change. So a couple things. Let's jump into one of our portals here. We can look at some of the things. So if we go to directory insights, you do have the ability to view things like admin activity. So you can see when changes were made, like within the Jumpcloud interface, for example. So that's one part of it. If we look at a specific device, let's look at a Windows device, right? We can see also device activity as well. And if we go down here to system info, we'll be able to export some other types of things here too. If you're looking for like specific device level log info, then I don't think there's much that we can do there. We only have visibility into what the Jumpcloud agent can see or the interactions that the device has with Jumpcloud. And then the second part of your question, if a change is made, is there a backup configuration? Tricky one to answer. Short answer is no. Like, there isn't a revert button that you can press within the admin console to revert back to a previous change. Going back to what I was showing with the directory insights there, in most cases, like if we look at an association change, and we expand on this, if we look at the actual JSON for it, we'll be able to see what the specific change was that occurred, right? So like in this case, the operation was to remove this user from a device, basically, is what that looks like. So you can see what happened in that specific event detail. The other thing that I'll comment on for this question as well is that the Jumpcloud API, the admin API, is very robust and very capable. And there's essentially parity with the API and the admin console. So although we don't have pre-built integrations with things like Terraform, for example, you could use the API to do more, administration as code. I think we'll probably eventually get there with pre-built integrations, but I mean, don't quote me on that. I'm not a product manager, so no promises there. But you could use the API to do some of those types of things to revert to a previous state, but that'd be more of a build it your own type of a thing, at least for now. But good question though. All right. Don't see any other questions coming in, so I think that's probably a good place to wrap it for the day. So just want to take a moment to say thanks everyone for joining. Appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Appreciate the engagement and activity. Love seeing all the questions come through here. I'm very glad that I asked Zach to join me at the last second, because I would not have been able to stay on top of all those questions by myself while presenting. So glad that worked out well. So we'll call it for today's session. For tomorrow, we're regrouping. That's going to be more centered around kind of how to demo these specific product areas to your customers. So we'll kind of do more focal or do more focus on some of these individual product categories, and kind of a bit more education on like how to demo, how to position them, potential objections that you might hear, and how to overcome them and things of that nature. So that'll be more the focus of tomorrow's session. So we'll regroup then. So thanks very much again, everybody. Appreciate the time, and yeah, we'll see you again tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you.